So what other considerations are involved in choosing policies? Okay, so which policy should be used tends to depend on two criteria uh, which economists use for evaluating policies. One is cost effectiveness and other is efficiency. Okay, the cost effectiveness tends to focus on input and output, and if the goal is reducing emissions, then they tend to focus on reducing emissions at minimum cost. Whereas efficiency in general is a long-term goal, focuses on strategies, on means and ends rather than just input and output, and that looks for maximizing benefits. So it looks at the net benefits over time and the cost involved in implementing it. So they can have very different outcomes, and the implementing them, of course, again depends on market-based policies that we already discussed and command and control policies. Market-based policies are found to be effective according to this author, but I suspect again it depends on whether you're a fan of market-based solutions or not. Command and control policies are found to be costly. Usually implementing regulations and policing them is costly. Somebody has to bear the burden, typically governments or entities like EPA or the Transportation Safety Agency and so on. Okay. In general, command and control policies can be more equitable and fair in some ways, but the argument is that even market-based policies can generate more revenues, and the revenues can be distributed more fairly. So obviously not the same outcome. The other idea is that just focusing on one policy like reducing emissions can have unintended consequences unless there are supplementary policies, like in this example, energy efficiency policies to unlock cost-effective potential bring you benefits. So the CO2 price for tons of CO2 equivalent here is, let's say, negative, that like we looked at before in terms of abatement cost and abatement curve. But then you have, so here is emission reductions in tons per carbon CO2 equivalent. The R&D in research, development, and deployment and technology deployment policies to reduce long-term costs can promote economy-wide mitigation. So the idea is that the ideal climate policy mix should address the cost of CO2 emissions, the barriers limiting cost-effective energy efficiency measures, and the research and development costs of new mitigation technologies. So when you make policies to reduce emissions, they shouldn't just focus on existing technologies and try to minimize cost or maximize efficiency, but they should also have supplementary policies that incentivize R&D and D and technology deployment policies. Okay, those are kind of the details. So here is examples of green policy approaches. If you want to accomplish green transformation on this end, then you have command and control regulations with technology and pollution standards, energy performance standards, waste regulations, sustainable public procurement, and market-based instruments which focus on environmental taxes and subsidies like cap and trade or subsidies for buying electric vehicles, payment for ecosystem services, not always easy to estimate the value, wetland banking, and information and voluntary system as well, where there is labeling and certification in terms of carbon footprint, for example, like the nutrient contents which are mandated now, information disclosure about the sources, for example, corporate codes of conduct, and voluntary programs. Okay, so that's kind of the policy mix approach, which is not just market-based or command and control, but both of them together with information and voluntary expectations. Okay, going back to this figure again, we looked at where the current policies are expected to lead us in the coming century, end of the century, what the NDC pledges and targets under Paris Agreement are going to get us, and why we need to go here if we want to meet these 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C targets. Okay, we should always already be on this path, and we clearly are not. So no climate policies will take us there, which pretty much is not an option, because despite the fact that 25 years of negotiations have not reduced emissions, investments in renewables, deployment of renewables, so R&D and deployment and technology deployments are already happening. So hopefully business as usual is not an outcome even in 2050, let alone in 2100. Okay. Let's see about that. Okay, here is a cost and benefit analysis. Despite the difficulties we have talked about so far about doing cost and benefit analysis about emissions, emission mitigation, impacts, costs of impacts, and policies, there are estimates put out like this for net benefits associated with conservation and restoration of mangroves. So cost benefit ratios are estimated here. Decarbonization of international shipping, ocean-based food production, offshore wind energy production, and so on. So there is the net benefit altogether of $15.5 trillion US dollars. So that should be a good motivation for investing in these, but there are lots of caveats that go with that as well. And this is from the Global Commission on Climate Adaptation, which did its own cost-benefit ratios taken from World Resource Institute for strengthening early warning systems like weather and climate prediction based early warnings for agriculture, for floods, extreme events, health, energy, and so on. So there's the net benefit in terms of cost-benefit ratio. There is a range over there. Making new infrastructure climate resilient, improving dryland agriculture crop production. So here we are talking about improving climate impacts or mitigating climate impacts on agriculture, protecting mangroves again, making water resources management more resilient. So such calculations are being made despite the discussion we have had on how difficult it is to put economic values on these things. Okay, so you have to read up on how those things are done despite the difficulties, what are the assumptions that go into it, and just because a cost-benefit ratio is provided with demonstration of net benefit, does that mean policymakers will accept it and make policies to follow through on those recommendations? Because those are recommendations of doing various things for climate adaptation and mitigation. Does that mean policymakers really buy those estimates? That's the question.